This is MER, Moroccan English Radio. Please subscribe to our channel to support us.
You're listening.
MER, the Moroccan English Radio, the first English radio in Morocco. The Moroccan English Radio.
Hello and welcome back. Thanks for joining us here on MER, Moroccan English Radio, the platform of English speakers in Morocco. You can always participate in the next podcasts by contacting us on WhatsApp or on our Facebook page. Today we have a different episode than the previous ones. We have an interview with Mr. Morad Al-Alami from Fez. He is an English teacher and we're going to ask him some questions about the situation of English teaching in Morocco and some general questions about the profession of teaching. First of all, thank you Mr. Morad for accepting the invitation.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi everyone. I'd like to thank you first and foremost, Mr. Faisal, for this precious invitation and all the MER team for their hard efforts to make the voice of the Moroccan English speakers heard far and wide. So Ramadan Mubarak to you and to all the listeners.
Well, thank you. Mr. Morad, to be an English teacher in Morocco, what are the requirements?
Well, in response to your first question, Mr. Faisal, let me say that in order for a university or a college student to become an EFL teacher in Morocco, there are some requirements he or she should fulfill at first. To begin with, the candidate must have a BE degree in a relatively high grade. This is number one. And number two, he or she, the university student, must sit for and pass a two-part written test. The first part deals with the English language skills the students have acquired throughout their schooling years, whereas the second part deals mainly with the issues related to didactics, or in other words, the theories, the methods, and the techniques of teaching English as a foreign language. Thirdly, after the candidate passes the written test and successfully, he or she then takes the oral test, which he or she needs to pass as well. Afterwards, after the student has passed both the written and the oral test, afterwards, what happens? The candidate receives a one-year training at the CRMEF. This is the name of the center in which the students receive their training. So CRMEF stands for the Regional Center for Professionals in Education and Training.
Do you urge Moroccan students to opt for this field of yours? And what are your advice for college students who are already in your path?
Now, to be honest with you, and in response to your question concerning whether I should advise, let's say, the university students to apply for this job, teaching or not. So my answer is, if money and wealth are all that interests you and concern you guys, believe me, teaching English as a foreign language or teaching any kind of subjects in general is the wrong choice for you. But if you already have some passion for this language and want still to help a large fraction of the Moroccan society to be able to understand and benefit from the cultures of all the English-speaking countries, like for example America, the USA, or Canada or Australia, all the English-speaking countries, and you want the Moroccan people who have acquired this new language, English, and you want them to share their own culture with the other English-speaking people, I would urge you to apply for this noble job once the requirements are met for you.
Well, Mr. Murad, Tell us, how many years have you been teaching English? And what are the difficulties that you have encountered during this time, whether they are linguistic difficulties or related to your profession in general?
Well, I've been teaching English as a foreign language for 9 years now. And frankly speaking, the most conspicuous difficulty I've ever met was back at my first 2 years of teaching, namely controlling a bunch of careless students who were more or less my age or a bit older at that time. At that time I was pretty young and my students were almost my age. And some of them were even older than I was, which really was a big issue for me. You know, when someone is younger than his students, he mostly finds it difficult to control him. And to top it all, the large majority of my students back then didn't have the least desire to learn English, so long as uh, they used to view it. They used to view English as gibberish, as something they couldn't understand, something like uh, what can I say? Something like Chinese or a difficult language we cannot understand here. In Morocco, something that's just pretty hard, something very very hard to understand. So I had to double my efforts to both gain their respect as a novice teacher, because back then I was a novice teacher, which means I was a new teacher, and to make them change their negative attitudes towards this language. And Alhamdulillah, thanks be to Allah, I succeeded. There are some other difficulties that faced me uh, as a new teacher, to be honest with you, like time and classroom management. But Alhamdulillah, I soon got over these problems over time.
Okay, we know that English is taught late in Moroccan schools, namely in the third grade of middle school. Do you think it should be taught earlier?
Yeah, English language is introduced to Moroccan public schools a bit late in comparison to French. For latter, French is taught at the second grade of primary school, while English is taught at the third level of middle school, at the ninth grade, to be more specific. Hence, we can refer back to the status of each of these two languages in the Moroccan linguistic situation. For French is considered as the second language in Morocco, whereas English is regarded as a foreign language. And you all know the difference between a second and a foreign language. This is why it is taught, English. This is why it is taught until the ninth grade. Concerning the second part of your question, Mr. Faisal, I mean, what I personally do to help promote my students to actively learn this language, English, frankly speaking, the strategy I follow uh, starts the very first day I meet my students. For I try to mentally and psychologically prepare them, my students, for learning English. So I start off by opening a real and a profound discussion with them concerning their views towards the language, uh, their fears, and their prior concerns as well. So they keep making complaints. My students usually, when I, let's say, have this profound discussion with them, what happens, they, most of the time, keep making complaints about their sufferings with French and how it usually plays the main part with their tragedy at school. At that level, when my students keep saying negative things about French and how it is usually the main part in their sufferings, at that level, I try to concentrate or I'm sorry, I try to console them, and I try to calm their fears by drawing their attention to the fact that they started learning French. I mean, these students who are now my students, they started learning French at an age when they were oblivious to the importance of acquiring a new language. I mean, when students start learning French in Morocco, they started at a very, very young age. I mean, when something like they are 7 or 8 years old. At that time, students are usually oblivious to the importance of acquiring a new language. And now, I mean, that's my students. When students start first learning English, they started at the third level of middle school. I mean, at the ninth grade. At that time, I keep telling my students, at that time you are mature enough, you are responsible enough to double your efforts to learn this prestigious language, so as not to go through the same scary scenario you have experienced with French, particularly. And Alhamdulillah, this strategy really works well with me, and it convinces my students, and Alhamdulillah, uh, we usually have a great and magnificent experience together, which remains until after they have succeeded and after they have gone to high school.
What is your vision about English teaching in the long term in Morocco?
As regards my vision about English teaching in Morocco in the long run or in the long term, I strongly believe that it will always be going from good to better, especially since Morocco is currently heading towards new economical strategies and plans. For Morocco no longer bases its incomes on farming as it did before, but now Morocco seems to be heading towards some new industries like automotive industry or car making like in Tangier or Casablanca with Renault, as well as tourism. And this is something that will keep the language, I mean English, alive in Morocco, even and may make its status prosper even more.
There is a stereotype about English among Moroccan students. They say that it is much easier than French. Is this true, Mr. Morad? Is French really crippling the country's development, in your opinion?
Yes, Sifisal. It is true. I mean, it is a common stereotype all over the country, all over Morocco, that English is easier than French, and that French stands as an obstacle between the country and a real development. It is true to some extent, in my view, but what really makes the majority of people in Morocco think so is the current status quo. For instance, try to figure out why the largest majority of students score higher in English tests than in French ones. The main reason behind that is not the simplicity of English and the complexity of French, in my view, but rather the matter has to do with the fact that students began learning English in Morocco at an older age, where they have already mastered some skills in French. I mean, these skills in their turn simplify their English learning process. Yes, and what's more, even the cliches and attitudes acquire, students accumulate over time, and what the society says about French and its complexity do negatively affect the student's view towards this language as well. So, yes, when, for example, the society keep repeating, I mean, when the father and the mother and even, let's say, the big brothers in the family keep repeating the fact that English is easy, French is difficult, and the little kids keep listening to their brothers, to their parents, to the society repeating these words, what happens? The students, I'm sorry, the I mean the little kids gets negatively affected by this view of the society, and hence they get to sort of hate the language before even they start learning it. Uh, thus, what happens? I mean, these kids, from the very beginning, they try to turn a blind eye and a deaf ear to this language, and this is why, in my point of view, why the some students seem to, or let's say the majority of students, seem to approve of English more than French, even when they score badly in both languages.
Okay, well, how can you describe the obstacles that lead some students to failure? What are your advice for them?
Well, the obstacles that lead students to failure in general are countless, and English language learning is no exception. For instance, the main obstacle that leads students to all kinds of failure and academic challenges later on is, in my opinion, the fact that students move from one educational level into the next one without having really mastered or grasped even the minimal basic knowledge and competencies that, that can allow them to transit from one grade to the next. So, personally speaking, I have some ninth grade students of mine. The third level students of middle school. I have some of them who still make awful spelling mistakes, even at their mother tongue. So they can't even, let's say, write a good, let's say, a well-spelled word in Arabic sometimes. And some other students still mispronounce actually some letters in French, let alone English. For instance, some of them pronounce the letter P as B, and others pronounce P as K. They also have some problems with the letter C, or they pronounce it like Ka sometimes. Another important obstacle that leads students to failure is, again, in my point of view, the quality and the quantity of lessons students receive at school. For there are some outdated and irrelevant lessons which students must learn so that they can pass the exam, which makes it hard for some of these students to concentrate on the lesson and give it enough attention. That's why I suggest that the Ministry of Education should move towards refreshing the syllabus of a large number of school subjects. It should also provide a good quality lessons and provide a good environment, or let's say good environments actually, and appropriate facilities and spaces for teachers to be even more creative. What's more, I suggest also that the Minister of Education in Morocco should also give more attention to pre and primary schools and try to start its reform right from there, because when we have a problem, we should always care about the roots, not the branches.
Thank you, Mr. Murad. This was really a rich interview with you today. To end this, please give us a last word. What can you say to MER team?
I'm very glad to be a guest of the Moroccan English Radio, and I'm even more excited to have found at last a platform from which I can make my voice heard to the English language speakers in Morocco in general, and hopefully to the future teachers of English in particular. So, thank you so much for having me on your radio programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murad Al-Alami. You are an English teacher from Fez. Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this interview. Thanks for listening to this episode. We still have a bunch of topics to talk about. Please contact us on our coordinates to participate. Everyone is welcome.
You're listening.
MER, the Moroccan English Radio, the first English radio in Morocco. The Moroccan English Radio.